by setting an example.
We're going to have to pause there because there are more questions. So do catch Glenn. And if there's a question not been answered online, we'll try and get that question to Glenn and try and get an answer if that person would like one. We're going to invite, yes, round of applause. We're going to invite our next speaker, Ruth, who is also from Northern College, a tutor there, appointed a little bit more recently than Glenn. Ruth also works for Inclusive Church, and we're very interested in your paper, which I haven't got in front of me, but I'll talk about.
Hi. Firstly, I'll just explain that I'm not Baptist, so don't expect it to be specific to Baptist churches. And I love this because I've never ever seen this in my life before, the baptistry being open. But I also have ADHD, so I'm inattentive. So I'm also terrified about falling in. So please, shout at me if I start to walk in the wrong direction. So in 1994, the American disability theologian Nancy Eastland published her seminal book, The Disabled God. Based on Luther's theology of the cross, Eastland's book develops Luther's ideas about humanity rediscovering its humanness and vulnerability. Eastland, like Luther, rejects the perfect God of glory in favor of a God who suffered. She subverts ableist norms and focuses on the wounds of God, which remain even after the resurrection. It was the first time a theology of the cross based on disability had been written, and it was pioneering for its time, sparking an interest in disability theology and bringing it into the mainstream. In this paper, I will argue that disability theology is a good corrective to some of the more harmful aspects of our theologies of the cross, for example, the idea of virtuous suffering, or the idea of perfection in the resurrection. Disability theology reminds us that suffering is not something to be glorified, and disabled people are not to be pitied or treated as heroic. Suffering is part of everyone's life to varying degrees, whether disabled or non-disabled. Also, the need to see ourselves and God as perfect is based in fear. A fear which harms both disabled and non-disabled people in different ways. The idea of Jesus as a disabled God, wounded both on the cross and post-resurrection, is helpful to theology and society because it aids us in accepting our own vulnerability and death, and it teaches us to see God in disabled people and disability in God. The theology of virtuous suffering has led to Christianity being criticized by some as a masochistic religion with a sadistic God. This kind of theology minimizes the struggle of the oppressed, robbing people of their right to be angry and to cry for justice. It also allows tyrants to get away with inflicting suffering on people because suffering is accepted as a moral good. It is not morally good or even morally neutral, though, when it's linked to oppression. It is, as Chris Shanahan says, an insidious form of violence. Even suffering which is not created by human hands can be experienced as a form of violence by its victims. Clearly, suffering is not something to be glorified, and there is a reason why the psalmist complains and cries out to God again and again, "Why, Lord?" Despite this, there is a version of Christianity which says that suffering is virtuous, that it is a form of divine testing, which we must submit to and overcome. This form of Christianity has made God into a cruel potter, requiring torment to make humans malleable enough to shape into what God wants us to be. Dorothy Searler describes the two tendencies in Christianity to view suffering either through the lens of masochism or apathy. In her opinion, the apathy is even worse than the masochism and comes from the idea of an impassible God, a God who does not feel anything. Searler argues that rather than seeing suffering as something to be borne heroically and virtuously to gain favor with God, or as something to be detached from as we strive for perfection, it is something simply to be accepted. It just is. Disability theology helps us to understand the Christian beliefs about suffering by reminding us that suffering is not a good virtuous thing, nor necessarily an entirely bad thing. It just is a part of life. It is neither a thing which is to be heroically overcome by superhuman people, nor avoided by people who see it as an aberration in an otherwise perfect life. Essentially, although suffering can sometimes be experienced as violence, especially when inflicted on oppressed people by society, disabled people show us that suffering is also an ordinary part of everyday life. Despite disabled people having too often been seen as virtuous sufferers and heroes, disability theology helpfully challenges and counterbalances the overemphasis on righteous suffering and martyrdom in the theology of the cross. Suffering has few heroes, least of all those who wish to live ordinary lives, explains Eastland. She wants to encourage Christians to see God in a new light, as disabled, wounded, but still powerful. For Eastland, the risen disabled God is neither simply a virtuous suffering servant, lacking agency and to be pitied, nor a mighty all-powerful Lord who is self-sufficient and dispassionate. Disability theology reminds us that the central theological point of the crucifixion narrative is not heroic suffering. Jesus did not choose to be tortured and killed because suffering is good in and of itself, but because saving himself from the cross would have been to avoid acting in solidarity with all those who suffer. In the language of the 21st century, God gave up God's privilege to die alongside those who do not have a choice. The cross shows us not God's approval of suffering, but God's almighty no to injustice, in the words of James Cohen. The crucifixion of Jesus is not about virtuous suffering. Instead, it reveals the wickedness of a domination system. Look, see how even God is put to death by you. For many disabled people, pain is just a part of life. It's not a tragedy or something to pity, neither is it something to overcome heroically. It is something which must be managed, but which is not to be glorified. There can be grief involved in coming to terms with disability, but as Eastland points out, the expression of grief is fundamentally different from the pronouncement of tragedy. Making a virtue of suffering, especially suffering in silence, is an insult to all those who deal with ongoing pain which affects their day-to-day life. It is also another form of othering and domination. Disabled people do not need to be made into heroes, as they have had enough of being singled out, whether that is to tell them that they are defective or to tell them that they are inspirational. Disability theology can help us to move away then from the glorification of suffering in our theology of the cross. It can teach us that suffering is not heroic or virtuous. Suffering can be experienced as a form of violence, especially if it is inflicted by a system of domination, but it is also just a part of life. Disability theology helps us to see God as not a conquering Lord, nor a piteous sufferer, but in the words of Eastland, as a survivor, a God of resistance with dignity and pain. Disabled people do not need to be given extra pity or extra praise for the suffering they live with, as it is only one aspect of their otherwise ordinary lives. In contrast to its glorification of suffering, Christianity has also historically equated disability and illness with sin. John Hull says that when the rhetoric against disabled people is examined in religion and culture, it is no wonder that disabled people were sent to concentration camps alongside Jews. Our society may have mostly moved on from equating disability with sin, but it still equates disability with tragedy, leading us all to believe our lives will be over if we ever become ill or disabled. Instead of using language like wheelchair bound and seeing a wheelchair as a step toward the grave, we should understand that a wheelchair is like a car for a disabled person who uses one. It is something which aids mobility and gives freedom. It is not something to be regarded as tragic. Equating disability with tragedy is detrimental to both disabled and non-disabled people, as it leads to the devaluing of disabled lives and a lack of preparation for, adaptation to, and acceptance of illness, disability, and death in our culture. The other side of the coin to suffering, tragedy, and sin is an impossible ideal of perfection that we have all got to live up to. We are all set up to fail, as most of us become disabled in some way later in life, if we're not already. Behind the narrative of disabled people as inspirational and heroic is the idea that disability is always something difficult and tragic, a falling short of perfection, which can only be overcome by exceptional individuals. Those individuals might even be seen as disabled superheroes. As wonderful as the Paralympics is as a place to showcase disability sport, much of the publicity surrounding it falls into this superhero narrative. The perfection narrative in society tells disabled people that they are exceptional if they can overcome their imperfections and show the world that they can achieve despite them. Otherwise, they are only to be pitied. Disability theology of the cross brings an imperfect, wounded God to the fore and breaks down the harmful association of God with perfection and disability with imperfection. Hull argues that in society there is no room for different worlds and different visions of how to be human, because the narrative is that there is one normal and perfect way of being. If perfection and strength is the norm, then disability and illness is a terrible deviation from the norm. The fact that we do not allow for a plurality of bodies and worlds is another narrative of domination and homogeny. Hull makes the valid point that until the non-disabled world rejects the idea of perfection and accepts the plurality and validity of every world, there can be no dialogue, because there is no conversation to be had with an absolute. Despite the secular world having moved on from equating disability with sin, in the church, the idea of disability as punishment from sin still exists. And this is linked to that old idea of the perfection and impassibility of God. It engenders pity and even resentment towards disabled people, whereas what disabled people really need is justice and respect. On the flip side, it makes the non-disabled fear disability and illness in themselves, in the same way that patriarchy harms all people, not just women. The societal and Christian ideal of the perfect, non-disabled, mentally and physically well person is damaging to all, whether disabled or not. Many of us still live with internalized messages from society that we are worthless if we become chronically ill or disabled. We do not learn to adapt and live differently when we become disabled or ill, and we are not taught to enable others to do the same. We are told instead that disabled and older bodies are a terrible tragedy to be avoided and feared. This idea is still prevalent in the entertainment industry, where films like Me Before You and The Sea Inside are two examples of what the actress Liz Carr calls a disproportionate number of stories which relate to the problem of disability being solved by death. In the medical world too, it is legal under UK law to abort a baby until it is coming down the birth canal, provided that baby has Down syndrome. Otherwise, a baby can only be aborted until 24 weeks. The implication in both these cases is that disabled lives are not worth living, and disabled people might as well have not even been born. On the contrary, the idea of a disabled God gives dignity and worth to disabled people. The cross is a good place to start to undo the damage of the ableist theologies of the past. The image of God in Jesus on the cross is not one of perfection and strength, or if it is a different perfection and strength. Jesus is bruised and pierced, with broken bones and internal injuries. He is, to all intents and purposes, disabled. His wounds are not glossed over, and they do not disappear when he is resurrected. In fact, they become the main identifier of who Jesus is. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe, says Thomas. The church, which has for so long argued about how we will become more perfect in the afterlife, has never imagined that there might be disabled people resurrected alongside non-disabled people. Yet the Christian Saviour does not appear post-resurrection with wounds healed. The image of God, which we had modelled on an able-bodied perfect human, has instead been transformed by the cross into that of a wounded and disabled human. If we are to have an anthropomorphic image of God, let's make it at least polyanthropomorphic, says John Hull, so that we include all people in the resurrected life of God. Jesus, according to the New Testament, was blinded, immobilized, and marginalized. And Hull makes this illuminating point that the perfect healer, Jesus, was changed by his experience on the cross, where once he healed humanity's infirmities, now he participates in them. God affirms the worth of disabled people by embracing disability on the cross and beyond. It is clear that although society has shifted from the idea that disability is a result of sin, it still holds to this belief that disability is a terrible tragedy, which might be a good enough reason to end it all. The negativity around disability in church and society stems from the myth that there is a perfect life that we can live and world that we can inhabit. As Hull explains above, this idea is itself the problem, as it is an absolute and abusively dominating and homogeneous. It does not allow for a variety of different and valid experiences, and it does not help people come to terms with their own changing circumstances as they develop ill health or disability in their own lives. We need to realize that the real sin in our world is not disability, but the idea of perfection, which influences our attitudes towards disability and the way we treat disabled people. Like the tragedy attitude and what journalist Ryan Gilbey calls the inspiration porn attitude towards disability, the over-focus on the specific vulnerability of disabled people can also be unhelpful. All of these attitudes exist because of our unwillingness to see that we are all vulnerable to illness, disability, and death, just as God is also vulnerable on the cross. Vulnerability is an important part of the human condition. By othering disabled and chronically ill people, we try to make ourselves feel safer about our own vulnerabilities and mortality. In the crucifixion narrative, we have a God who confronts and accepts disability and death head on. The cross means that we can no longer talk of vulnerable people and non-vulnerable people with honesty. We have seen that even God is vulnerable to torture, pain, abandonment, suffering, disability, and death. The benefit of thinking theologically about disability is that we begin to see that unlike those who try to deny their vulnerability, often disabled people have no choice but to acknowledge it. Disabled people are vulnerable in part because of their conditions and illnesses, but also because of what disability activists have termed the social model of disability. This model explains that a large part of the added dependence which disabled people live with is due to the way society is set up. A wheelchair user feels independent if there are ramps everywhere and automatic wheelchairs, but if they have to depend on someone else to get around and can't get through doors or upstairs without help, they are made to feel more vulnerable in society. So society disables people and makes disabled people feel less independent and more excluded. As we delve deeper into disability theology, we not only realize then that we are all vulnerable, we also realize that disabled people are not as vulnerable and dependent as we might imagine. In fact, it is our negative attitudes and our ableist society which has for too often refused to compromise or create a world suited to all people, whether they are hearing or deaf, sighted or blind, walking or wheeling. Firstly, we must accept that we are all vulnerable and dependent on one another at different times in our lives and in different ways. And this is something which a disability theology of the cross can help us with. Secondly, we must accept that disabled people are a marginalised group, what Hull calls the marginalised within the marginalised. Disabled people are a crucified people, in the words of Ignacio Ellacuria. And just like other marginalised groups, they deserve autonomy, agency, and liberation from oppression. The problem of homophobia, sexism, ableism, etc., is not with marginalised people. The problem is with the society which oppresses. Disability does not equal imperfection or weakness. In fact, disability and suffering can sometimes bring unique spiritual insights which non-disabled people cannot access. Neurodivergent people, of which I am one, would agree with this, as we have different brains which see things differently to other people. And this can be a huge gift. John Hull would also have agreed with this, having written his most appreciated and respected theology after he went blind. We all need one another, and that includes non-disabled people needing the gifts and insights of disabled people. Equating disability with weakness and imperfection is insulting to disabled people, unhelpful to the cause of disabled liberation, and ultimately untrue. We are all weak and imperfect, whatever that means, in different ways. We also all have strengths and gifts. When we remove the power dynamic of the perceived strong and the perceived weak, we can begin to see that power does not equal domination. There is another kind of power which Paul understood and which Jesus participated in. This is what Frederick Herzog calls countervailing power. It is a strength which comes from weakness and a power which comes through solidarity. Paul has some interesting things actually to contribute to a conversation on disability and theology. He himself had what he termed a thorn in his side, interpreted by many as a physical disability or a long-term illness. Although he associated it with hardship, he also saw it as a strength, making him less arrogant. Whereas the Bible in other places talks negatively about blindness and equates it with willful misunderstanding, Paul sees sightlessness as a symbol of faith. Whereas Christianity links disability to primordial sin and what Candida Moss calls extraneous corrupt matter to be cast off in the resurrection, Paul says that his thorn gives him a greater connection to Christ. Paul's positive attitude to his own probable disability can help Christians to be more disability positive. Paul also wrote about a different kind of power, God's power, which was perfected in weakness, 2 Corinthians. Jesus chose solidarity and perceived weakness over strength and power, which he could have used to escape the cross. Jesus chose to unmask the violence of empire, not by taking up arms and using a greater violence against it, but by dying alongside all those who die at its hands. The important third way between power and powerlessness is countervailing power. It is not power over people, it is what community organizers call power with. Countervailing power is not a domination of the powerful over the weak and marginalized, but a power which lifts up and enables, which empowers the poor and oppressed, and which lives in solidarity with others. Our power and our strength lie counterintuitively in recognizing our common vulnerability and weakness, our need for one another. God shares in that vulnerability and guides us away from domination into a place of countervailing power, where instead of hurting and harming one another, we lift one another up and come alongside one another in both suffering and joy. Our true power lies in the realization that we are, like Paul, closer to God when we accept our weakness and vulnerability, but also, like Jesus, can only save the world when we are in solidarity with others. So to conclude, disability theology has a lot to bring to the table when it comes to a theology of the cross, grounded in the experiences of marginalized peoples. Disabled people are themselves one of the most marginalized peoples in the world. Much of the disability which disabled people experience does not stem from their conditions or illness, but from the way they are excluded from society. The social model helps us to understand how our society disables and makes life difficult for disabled people. Disabled people are, along with other oppressed and marginalized people, a crucified people. Nancy Eastland wrote about Jesus as the disabled God, with his wounds remaining even after the resurrection. This was a powerful image, especially as disability had long been viewed in the church and society as an imperfection, a defect, a tragedy, something to fear, and even a product of sin. Disability theology has helped us to understand that suffering is not something to pity, nor is it something for heroic people to overcome. Eastland, Hull, and others have taught us that disabled people's experiences are not just defective versions of non-disabled people's experiences, but valid and valuable in themselves, another different reflection of God. Disabled people's experiences can lead us to greater insight and wisdom as a community as we learn about how we are all dependent and vulnerable. Disability theology can help us to realize how we have othered and excluded disabled people out of fear. It can help us to accept our own vulnerability and prepare for our own illness, disability, and death. Conversely, it can help us to see that disabled people are not as vulnerable and weak as we might think, and that disabled people sometimes only appear more dependent and vulnerable because of the way society unnecessarily marginalizes them. The image of a vulnerable and wounded God on the cross is powerful, but it is only helpful alongside an equally powerful image of an independent, liberated, disabled person.
Ruth, thank you for introducing us or reminding us of the gift that disability theology can be to the task of theology and being the church. Any questions in the room? Edward.
Thank you so much, Ruth. What a great paper. I'm really intrigued by your comments about perfection. I mean, I love and think it's beautiful, this idea that in the eschaton, disabled people will still be disabled. Not everybody agrees with that, but I think that's quite a beautiful thing. But my question really is about perfection. And I think many of us, I guess, certainly myself, have grown up with this idea of the perfection of God and, in quotes, kind of in the eschaton, there will be perfection. You seem to be suggesting a couple of things. One, that there won't be that perfection in the eschaton, and neither is God perfect. Do you agree? And if so, could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm questioning that, really. Yeah, because I think this kind of preoccupation with the perfection of God is probably more a Greek idea that's come in the beginning of Christianity. And I think that that really there's, for example, when Thomas says that about Jesus, it seems that Thomas was expecting Jesus to come out with wounds intact in the resurrection. He didn't seem to, and none of the disciples seemed to think that he should come out perfected. There was no idea there about that. So I do think that some of that preoccupation with the afterlife being this kind of perfected world is definitely Greek. Obviously, there are bits of the Bible where it says there'll be no suffering and pain. I think that's a little bit different for me, because there are plenty and loads of disabled people who will say that they don't wish to be different than they are. But they would wish maybe, and as we all would, whether disabled or not, to maybe not have pain. I think we had a very interesting discussion about this actually at the last Inclusive Church and St. Martin in the Fields Disability Conference. Some people were even saying that their pain in some ways was giving them insight and blah, blah, blah. So even there's nuance. But I think in general, there's a difference between kind of really awful pain that you would hope would be kind of released, you would be released from, and then disability, which is just often just a difference in the way people are. There's a beautiful passage that I used in teaching the other day, where I believe it's the bit in Exodus where Moses is kind of, because Moses looks often like could be a disabled person with his speech impediment, etc. But there's a bit where God says, did I not make people deaf, and did I not make people blind and make them seeing? And it's almost like God is saying, actually, I just made this variety of people. So yeah, we need to look at those bits of the Bible as well, I think.
There's a question from online.
Thank you. Yeah, this is from Edward Sini. What can churches do practically to help those who are disabled overcome this idea of perfection?
Well, I think there's so much that can be done practically to make disabled people more feel more included in general. And it's our attitudes towards kind of the way that we speak about I guess in the pulpit, but also the way that we've been taught as Christians to view this kind of ideal of perfection has influenced the way we speak to disabled people practically, for sure. So I think in terms of trying to get rid of that attitude, I think education is always key, and trying to have that conversation about and bring in, like we've talked about with other speakers, bring in the voices of the marginalized, get disabled people to talk about their own experiences, read things written by disabled people themselves. There's some brilliant books, I could point you to, but that kind of thing is a place to start. And then, of course, practically, churches just need to also, in listening to disabled people, do certain things that actually, many of which are very simple. Don't talk over people because they're in a wheelchair. Don't talk to their carer. Don't, make sure that you can get people in, and it's not like they don't have to ask for access. The access is just obvious. Put things on websites so they know how to find things without having to ask. And there's often this thing with disabled people where you feel uncomfortable. You're made to feel uncomfortable, actually, by society that kind of makes you have to ask for a special entrance or a special ramp, or just make it much more fluid, much better for people, so that they don't feel always excluded and marginalized, I'd say. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Can I just make one other comment that's coming online? I think it would be helpful for us to particularly hear this one. This is from Martin Hobden, who says, regarding Ruth's comment about God making disabled people as they are, Psalm 139, you saw my unformed body in the womb, and he's paraphrasing. And he goes on, please mention that there are disabled ministers and others who are able to speak and preach from personal experience of disability. Yours truly, for instance, smiley face.
Yes, of course. And I do struggle with that in a way that obviously I'm not physically disabled, and I like to talk about disability. Actually, this is the third chapter of a dissertation, an MA dissertation, that was about all liberation theologies in the cross. So this is me pulling out disability theology from that. But yeah, I mean, I'm in the big umbrella of disability, having a neurodivergent condition, but yes, I am not physically disabled, and there are lots of people that can talk much more eloquently about their own personal experience of that, of course.
Okay, we've got one more quick question.
So hi, I'm Josh. What would you say that the kind of gospel accounts of Jesus, and especially the crucifixion, can offer those whose disability, whether that be physical or otherwise, has come through trauma?
Well, I mean, I think really that the main thing is the solidarity thing, is that I think throughout my dissertation on all the liberation theologies, whether that's Black theology, Latin American liberation theology, or disability theology, those are the three I focused on, really. It's always, actually, it comes back to that idea of the important part of what Jesus did is this solidarity with people who suffer. And so I would say that it's the same really about the people that have got disability or have got trauma. And of course, there's also mental health conditions, which often, if they're long-term, come under that disability umbrella as well in the Equality Act. It depends. This is a question from Martin Hobden, which is interesting as well. It's like, how do you define disabilities? In the Equality Act, I'm disabled. Under the Equality Act, my wife is disabled because she has long-term depression. So I mean, it's so is it very much a grey area, really. But yeah, I think definitely focusing on the solidarity of Jesus on the cross, and focusing on even going back further into Judaism, this idea that God dwells with us in the Shekinah and God is with us. I mean, there's a beautiful, it's a horrifically painful book by Elie Wiesel, the Jewish writer who was in the concentration camps, Night. But there's this amazing bit where he's not at all Christian, but he says this thing that all Christians kind of pick up on, where he says that who's there dying, where's God with that man hanging? It was a boy hanging. Where's God? And he felt a voice say, God is there on hanging with that boy. And a lot of interpreters and commentators that were not Christian interpreted that as him losing his faith, like God had died. But a lot of Christians read that like, yes, of course, God is suffering with this boy. That's exactly where God is. That's how we read it. So it's really interesting.
Okay, thank you, Ruth.
Okay, thank you.
We've got another break. We're back at 1:45. And so there's an opportunity to have a chat with Glenn or with Ruth or with any of the other speakers who haven't done so far. We're back at 1:45.